Yesterday was Corruption Day here in Washington. It started at the National Press Club with Elizabeth Warren unveiling what she called her Anti-Corruption Act. It's a sweeping set of reforms that she called radical and which would be radical relative to what the current state of play is here in Washington. But the fact that you could call this a huge step, what she was proposing a huge step, shows you just how deep the rot here is in Washington. Effectively, what Warren is trying to do with her legislation is to say that you can't profit from your public service. It's as simple as that. There are a lot of complicated ways that she tries to squeeze the profit motive out of public service, but that's effectively what she's trying to do. On top of that, she bans all foreign lobbying, which is probably something that I think you're going to see a lot of other Democrats start to get behind, this idea that if a foreign government wants to influence policy here in the United States, they have an embassy here. They have embassy staff. They can try to work the members of Congress and the State Department like people have been doing for centuries. But you can't bribe American officials or people close to members of Congress or members of Congress through these foreign agents. Now, she picked quite a day to make her anti-corruption push. Later in the day, Paul Manafort, convicted of 8 corruption-related charges. How many? Michael Cohen was convicted of how many? 8. Also 8. This is the campaign manager for the 2016 Trump campaign, and his longtime fixer and lawyer, Michael Cohen. And then in the evening, we learned San Diego Congressman Representative Duncan Hunter was indicted along with his wife for misusing $250,000 of campaign funds. He was taking that money, he was paying for his kids' private school tuition, flights, vacations, and some of it was a little extra devious. In the indictment, it says that he and his wife went clothes shopping at a golf pro shop and listed it in the campaign records as golf balls for the troops. But in fact, they were buying clothes for themselves. His opponent is somebody you may remember from the reporting that we've done here in the past. His name's Ammar Campa-Najjar, and he's only his opponent in the general election because he beat an establishment Democrat in the primary. His name was Josh Butner, and this was a fascinating race for a couple of reasons. One, you had your typical kind of progressive populist divide. You had the progressive populist Ammar Campa-Najjar, and you had a more moderate establishment candidate in Butner. Butner had the backing of Joe Crowley, of Steny Hoyer, of Seth Moulton, the whole kind of coterie of those elements without the official endorsement of the DCCC. I believe the DCCC didn't officially endorse him because this is a district that Republicans consistently win more than 60% of the vote in. So it's not the kind that was even necessarily on their radar, but it was one that was important to follow. And the reason we covered it is because Duncan Hunter was known at the time to be under federal investigation. And the basic facts that were unearthed in the indictment are new, but the general circumstances were known. The idea, there had been a lot of reporting around the way that he had been using his campaign money to fund what had become a lavish lifestyle. His father had been a congressman for 30 years, and he was accustomed to living in a kind of rarefied part of our society, without the kind of 0.1% income to do that, he was using his campaign money to kind of make ends meet, so to speak. So Ammar Campa-Najjar wound up beating Josh Butner. In fact, Butner, by 7 votes, ended up finishing 4th. A Republican finished in 3rd place. So that means that the general election now pits Campa-Najjar against Duncan Hunter. Because of California's top 2 system, Duncan Hunter, he can get off the ballot if he asks a judge to take his name off. There's no indication that he has any plans of doing that. But the Republican Party can't put anybody new on, and you can't write anybody in. So the choice for voters in this area of California is Duncan Hunter or Campa-Najjar. Campa-Najjar, fascinating figure. He, a working class kid from the area, raised by a single mother, Mexican American. His father was Palestinian American, and it emerged during the campaign that his grandfather, on his father's side, was a rather famous terrorist, Palestinian terrorist. What's his name? Muhammad al-Najjar, who was said to be a mastermind of the 1972 Munich attack, where Israeli athletes were massacred. A year later, in retaliation for that, Israeli forces found al-Najjar in Beirut and killed him and his wife. So he died long before Campa-Najjar was born. He's now still revered by some in the Gaza Strip, where he was from. There's a hospital actually named after this terrorist, which Israel in 2014 bombed as part of its war on Gaza, coming full circle. Campa-Najjar, after this news came out, did not yet have the endorsement of the state party, but he'd won the endorsement of the local parties, and there was some concern: will he be smeared by his association, tarred by his association to his dead grandfather here? And that turned out not to be the case. J Street has endorsed Campa-Najjar. A lot of local rabbis have endorsed him. The Jewish community in the district has rallied behind him because of his message of kind of peace and reconciliation. And shortly after that, the reporting on who his grandfather was came out. The Democratic Party in California overwhelmingly endorsed him, which is interesting because you have multiple parties going on. You've got the National Democratic Party, which was mostly aligned with his opponent Butner, but the California Democratic Party, which follows the lead of the local parties, got behind Campa-Najjar. So Eric is here monitoring the comment section. We're here. Welcome to our new office. This is our new Intercept Washington, D.C. headquarters.
Well, even before you mentioned the Duncan Hunter indictment, someone said, how about that ass clown, Duncan Hunter?
How about that guy? I mean, if you read the indictment, it looks very bad for him. His arraignment is on Thursday. It's still not a lock. He's raised, Campa-Najjar's probably raised about $1.5 million so far. He thinks he needs about another $1.5 million between now and the end of the election to get the message out of who he is and what is happening with Duncan Hunter. I was talking to a Democrat in that district today who said, the number of things that Republicans here in Southern California have been willing to overlook in their elected officials is staggering. So we don't know what the limit is. If he's convicted, maybe that helps. Right now, he's only indicted, and he'll be arraigned on Thursday.
I remember when you interviewed Campa-Najjar, and he mentioned that he was being investigated. And it's funny how being investigated versus being indicted, just in my mind, psychologically, I don't know about the average voter, but it just means more. And, whatever amount of damage that has been done to our belief in our justice system by Trump and his supporters, I think that the average American, and actually I've been finding this on the campaign trail. Last night I was in West Virginia, and again, half of the Trump supporters I talked to said they support Mueller over Trump when it comes to whether this investigation should continue.
Yeah, we have the rule of law ingrained into our psyche, our DNA as Americans. And the other thing about an indictment is that it spells out in precise detail what the accusations are. It's one thing to say you're under federal investigation for corruption and for using campaign funds improperly, and here is what the news reports have said. It's another thing to say, here is what the prosecutor wrote in the indictment. Now, everybody's innocent until proven guilty, but that doesn't mean that voters can't look at the facts before them and render their own judgment on whether or not this guy ought to be writing and passing laws.
So, it's so interesting how, Rudy Giuliani is always talking about this rule that you can't do anything starting September 1st that might influence an election. So this indictment, the timing of it is interesting. It's before September 1st, but it's also after Californians went to the polls to decide the top two candidates. So they're stuck with Duncan Hunter or Campa-Najjar.
Yes, and there were a lot of Republicans in the area who were privately hoping that he would be indicted before the primary, so that it would sink him and a different Republican would be able to get into the general election. And I think that you're right. The prosecutors here followed kind of the letter of the rules around not interfering in elections, which means you're not supposed to drop indictments after Labor Day in an election year. But they certainly violated the spirit here. And I'm not saying they did anything right or wrong, but the spirit of the idea that law enforcement should not be deciding elections was certainly violated in this case.